of your understanding of Wittgenstein can be developed out of Tractatus. And there are very responsible and scholarly Wittgenstein pundits who would argue for reading Wittgenstein in very different ways. And the other question is, like, in art, sometimes we say that we can understand art in our own way. The audience, the reader, is also an artist, and could have the could have and should have the prerogative to understand and construct meaning in the art. But as a philosophy text, there is also this tendency to understand the meaning of that text in terms of the intention of the philosopher. So, what did the philosopher want to say? And this kind of interpretation of any work, which is already problematic in terms of its ontology of existence, is difficult, because the author is not there anymore, and the author's intention is difficult to reconstruct. Priyangvadadi does, as one could do in those situations, is to refer back to the diaries or the letters to other people, and the records of conversations that the philosopher Wittgenstein might have had with other people. So all these things are taken together sometimes to develop an argument in terms of the reading strategy that one should take in terms of the Tractatus. So she refers back to a lot of letters to writings of Engelmann, or one von Fricke and others whom Wittgenstein communicated at that point of time to build her argument, which is to say that Wittgenstein was not dismissive of what is outside those limits. Ethics, aesthetics, and religion, metaphysics, and even the propositions of Tractatus, in a sense, are nonsensical or would fall outside the limits of language. But he thought that those nonsenses were important or significant nonsense. So this is the argument that this is the kind of reading that Priyangvadadi tries to argue for. But this is one thing. This is the strategy, the reading strategy of Tractatus that one could argue for, and that I think I would agree with Priyangvadadi. But on the other hand, she also enriches this book by bringing in a lot of discussion on Tagore, not just in the context of understanding Wittgenstein, but Tagore in itself. So Tagore himself is as important a part of this book as Wittgenstein is. So it's not just that we are understanding Wittgenstein and we are using Tagore or Tagore's view in the context of understanding Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein is, of course, there, and within that context, we are also learning a lot about Tagore and how Tagore, whom sometimes I think she talks about as a reluctant philosopher, philosophizes about a lot of issues in aesthetics, art, and other things, and about language and our ability to grasp something which is beyond or feels to be outside the ability of language to capture. So the other questions, of course, are like whether Wittgenstein was aware of other works from Tagore, because Tagore's this poem and a play, the Gitanjali, list of a series of poem songs, and Raja, which is a play, whether outside of this Wittgenstein had read any of Tagore's work, because most of the work that Priyangvadadi refers to, or things from Tagore to understand Tagore, are not just this work. So these are like where he does the thing, he does the poetry, he does the play, he uses the language in ways to communicate something extra linguistic or transcendental to language. But the theory about all these things is not there in these poems or in this play as such. So whether Wittgenstein was aware of the theory that Tagore was using, or his way of dealing dealing with language and art, that is another question, because then what comes out is that they were trying to do the same kind of things. They had similar kind of motivations. They had similar kind of philosophical vision. which was there at the back of their mind, but the theoretical aspect they were not aware of as such. Uh, One can see another thing that comes up here is in trying to understand Wittgenstein in the context of Tagore, is to see Tagore is to see Wittgenstein's Tractatus itself as a literary work. So Wittgenstein's Tractatus itself is something which is like a poem, or something. It's not a philosophical work, but a literary work, because the Tagore poems and plays, they are literary works, and literary work has this ability to go and capture something beyond what is literary in those in that presentation. It goes. It has vanjana. It has it has suggestiveness. It has indirection in terms of its production of meaning. So there is a and Priyangwadi also goes back and tells us that at certain points Wittgenstein does say that this is a literary work, that Tractatus is a literary work, but so it has a philosophical purpose, but at the same time it is a literary work. So this is also a way. One could do an aesthetic reading of the Tractatus, just as one could do an aesthetic reading of a poem or a play or a film. So Tractatus itself, if it's a literary work, then one could do an aesthetic reading of it. And there are portions in the preface where Wittgenstein does say that the worth of the Tractatus would be established if someone gets pleasure out of the reading of the book. So pleasure is something, or anando, as Rabindranath says, is something that we get out of reading a literary work. Of course, a philosophical work can also lead to some kind of fulfillment, pleasure, enlightenment, and that thing is there. But this is another This is also another strategy to read Tractatus, itself as a literary work, work open to translation, open to interpretation, open-ended in that sense. One thing I thought Tolstoy and Dostoevsky was mentioned somewhere in the book, but I thought that in trying to connect Wittgenstein and Tagore, one could put a lot of one could go back a step and maybe connect them through Tolstoy, because both of them were influenced by Tolstoy, as was Gandhi. So at that point of time, Tolstoy was a big influence. It's a story. I don't know. I think it's true that Wittgenstein had Tolstoy's version of the Bible with him when he went to war around the time when he was writing the Tractatus, and I think the notebook phase. And so Tolstoy was a big impact, had a big impact on Wittgenstein, and also Rabindranath was influenced by Tolstoy. And if we go back, then we'll see that a lot of the ideas of expressionism in art. Tolstoy was an expressivist. In art, he says that the function of art is to convey emotions, and just as propositions convey fact, and artwork conveys emotions. And this idea of ethical, being ethical, or good art required to be ethical, is also that is very strongly there in Tolstoy. So this connecting ethics and aesthetics might also be there in Tolstoy, and something that both of them get from Tolstoy, or again, we can't say whether one is being influenced directly by the other. But of course, there are parallels again between with Tolstoy, Tagore, and Wittgenstein. So again, I'd like to the strategy for understanding Wittgenstein is when in the Vienna Circle, there are stories that he went to attend the Vienna Circle meetings, the logical positivist meetings, and by that time he had already written the Tractatus, published it, spent some time doing other kinds of things. And then he got back to, again, a discussion group where Tractatus was being discussed. But he was not happy with the way the logical positivists were understanding Tractatus or the purpose of Tractatus. What so he would go with Tagore's poems or Tagore's play, and what can we make out of it? Was he just a casual thing? Was he just reading, just as we carry any book with us that we are reading at the moment to a place where we are going and we think we'll have some free time? Was it like that, or was it a statement that, okay, I'm carrying this book? Or I'm reading that book while the meeting is going on. So all these things are they? How much should we read into it? And I think that it's also could be that it could be that read me as you would read Tagore. So read the Tractatus as we would read Tagore. That could be one way of approaching Wittgenstein over there in his association, or his kind of carrying the Tagore book with him. So these are some of the things that I thought about the book. But general the different chapters of the book and their summary, I think I didn't get into that. Maybe someone from the other discussants would get into it. If
Sure.
somebody does, then I can come back and talk about it. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Mukherjee. Now I would like to request Professor Maitri Datta to share her views. Professor Datta.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Give me just 2 minutes since I'm starting.
Sure.
Just. Thank you very much, Professor Panda, for giving me such an opportunity, and I really thankful to Priyambada. I don't know why she has chosen me to respond to her book on Wittgenstein, because there are so many Wittgenstein scholars. I feel really feel jittery and nervous before them to present a very small response of mine, but it's very nice of her and you that you are giving me such an opportunity to share a few of my views with such an esteemed group. And really, as Anirban has just mentioned, that it is an experience to read Priyambada's book on Wittgenstein, and it is a great help for me that Anirban has so nicely presented the theme of the book and related and explained matters important here, and how the author has related Wittgenstein and Tagore and shown their resonance, which is extremely important for this book. And the crux of the book, as he has justly mentioned, that the language limit and beyond, and this is the apt title of the book. So with such initial remark, I'd like straight come to a few observations that I would like to share with you. And since Anirban has given a very good description of the book and the contents of the chapters, so I'm not going to repeat it again, because it is not necessary, I think, to repeat the same thing again and again. As I'm not a Wittgensteinian scholar, but I like to read metaphysics, and my core area of interest is philosophy of time, and I also would like to study this philosophy of time within the purview of metaphysics. So, in reading this book, I had come across certain very crucial metaphysical, I can say metaphysical, or I don't know whether I should say metaphysical, but certain issues which are not very common to any book of analytic philosophy. Actually, all of us, when we, during our studenthood, have studied Wittgenstein, especially early Wittgenstein, Tractatarian Wittgenstein, we have found him very much in the framework of analytic philosophy, and the logic, rigor with which he has composed the book Tractatus. At that time, we didn't know that such a flavor which Priyambadadi has brought about in this book was there in Tractatus. But as I have got the opportunity to read this book authored by Priyambadadi, I have come to know that I have come to know Wittgenstein in a new light, actually. And though we have also read philosophical investigations of later Wittgenstein, and there we have found a shift from the analytic philosophical perspective, yet this new Wittgenstein, that he was very much there in Tractatus, is a revealing thing for me, and especially the point or the main theme of the book, Language, Limit and Beyond, is such an interesting one that I felt very good and very opportune to read and express my feeling in this regard. Now, a book of this kind not only is worth studying for philosophical value, but signifies a far more important aspect of human life, namely the eloquence of the silence. Now, in the third chapter, Priyambadadi has written very eloquently about this silence, which Wittgenstein has tried to emphasize, as well as Tagore. And in this particular point, he has tried to show the resonance between these two stalwarts that we come to know when we read the book. And especially this silence becomes very important, relevant, and a predominant theme of whole of the book, because it expresses the important distinction or demarcation between said and unsaid, which is the running thread of whole of the book. That is the demarcation, the distinction between said and shown, said and unsaid, which is there in the Tractatus of Wittgenstein, as well as Rabindranath Tagore, which the author has tried to depict. Now, the importance of the domain outside the limit of thought and language for human life has been highlighted time and again by philosophers of the East and the West, including poets and seers. The author has very aptly indicated the limit of the language and the domain beyond it beyond it about which Wittgenstein has chosen to remain silent. That our language is confined to the realm of sensible does not close human aesthetic, moral, and religious endeavors. Both Tractarian Wittgenstein and the poet Rabindranath Tagore have admitted these as essential aspects of human life. Now, these aspects, that is, aesthetic, moral, religious endeavors, these endeavors can only make a person, a human being, complete. It is not only the logical or cognitive enterprise that can make a person complete. In order to be complete, a person has to be aesthetic, moral, and religious also. So all these endeavors are not unimportant. That has been shown by Wittgenstein, and as Priyambadadi has aptly suggested, that for understanding tractatus of Wittgenstein, we must not confine our attention to this book only. We have to read his notebook, his letters to his friends, and other writings also. Only with reference to those later writings we can understand his tractatus better. Otherwise, it will sometimes become puzzling, sometimes contradictory, sometimes very terse. But if we read his writing on ethics, his writing on his notebook, and especially his personal letters to his friends, we come to understand why it is said that in this particular book, Tractatus also, his intention is to demarcate the said from unsaid, and he wants to give importance and emphasis on unseen, also unsaid, also with the said. Most of the interpreters of Wittgenstein confine their attention to the said aspect, which is very logical, very well articulated and everything. Even the logical positivists have interpreted him in this manner. But that is not the only interpretation of Tractatus. We have come across other interpretations, and Priyambadadi in her book has tried to highlight those interpretations where it is said that Wittgenstein has tried to show that which is not said in Tractatus. So actually Tractatus, through its logical analysis of language and meaning and etc., tries to show what is not said in Tractatus and which is only shown, and the glimpse of which has been shown. It is not said, it is the unsaid aspect, and that is also very important. Now, the author has very aptly indicated the limit of the language and the domain beyond it about which Wittgenstein has chosen to remain silent. That our language is confined to the realm of sensible does not close human aesthetic, moral, and religious endeavors. Both Tractarian Wittgenstein and the poet Rabindranath Tagore have admitted these as essential aspects of human life. The author aptly said, following Ray Monk, that in Tractatus, Wittgenstein highlights the demarcation between what can be said and what cannot. The domain of language is the domain of said, which has its limit, and everything beyond this limit of language is that which cannot be said. Wittgenstein holds that which cannot be said can be shown. Now, this unsaid, the shown realm, which is beyond the realm of said, is the realm of silence. So, in this way, silence becomes so important in the context of tractators also. And we know that for Rabindranath Tagore also, in his several poems, he tries to give this glimpse of the zone of silence about which nothing can be said, but through his poems, he only tries to give the glimpse of that silent zone where utterings are not possible. There are many interpretations on Tractatus, but most of these overlook this unsaid aspect, which is the most essential for Wittgenstein. The author in this book has sought to talk about this limit of language and beyond which cannot be grasped by the discursive linguistic structure. That the unsaid aspect is not less important than the said one has been stressed upon by Wittgenstein. The language which expresses the sensible domain of our experience is not befitting to express those human experiences which fall outside the domain of senses, and for this particular reason, Wittgenstein determines this beyond as nonsense. So, the meaning of nonsense is not trivial or meaningless. It means that it is not sensible. It is different from sensible. So this particular meaning of nonsense should be understood here. I think, and rightly Priyambadadi has pointed out, that logical positivists have misunderstood Wittgenstein in this particular understanding of nonsense. For Wittgenstein, it is not meaningless or trivial. It is important. It is also very much respectable in a sense, but it is not sensible. So in that sense, it is nonsense. Here he sets himself apart from the logical positivists who have refused to give any importance to this beyond which falls outside the domain of language. This articulation of Wittgenstein's view regarding the limit of language and beyond reminds us of another great Western philosopher of all time, that is Immanuel Kant, who in a similar manner talks about the limit of knowledge and also leaves space for the beyond of this knowledge in which morality and aesthetic endeavors flourish. Though there are many dissimilarities between Kant and Wittgenstein, yet in this respect we can grasp a resonance between these two stalwarts of Western philosophy and are reminded how important this issue of demarcation is, the issue which is the demarcation between said and unsaid, between cognitive and non-cognitive. Wittgenstein seeks to relegate what cannot be said into silence. Now, limit is applicable in the context of language and cannot be used for the unsaid. Here it is said, and the author has very beautifully explained it, that the term limit we cannot use in the domain of unsaid, because it is a linguistic concept, limit. So it can only be used in the context of language, which is said. But if there be something beyond this sensible language, where it is regarded as the domain of unsaid, then there we cannot use even the term limit, because it is very much linguistic. This zone of silence is very important for Wittgenstein, which is impregnated with the unsaid. That which falls outside the domain of language is more important for Wittgenstein than that which he has stated in Tractatus. A poem expresses much more from the literal meaning of it. Here comes the resonance between Wittgenstein and Tagore. Now, in Indian context, a poet, that is Kavi, is a seer who has a power to see far. In this sense, a darshanik who sees comes very close to a Kavi. Several of Tagore's poems require going beyond the limit of language. Here, indirect communication is found both in Tractatus and in the poems of Tagore. Wittgenstein respects those human tendencies also which do not contribute to our cognitive domain. I would like to mention and give emphasis on this term respect, which Priyambadadi has mentioned in her book. This respect is very important, because in our literature, in the Indian context, in Kathopanishad, we find that Shraddha, which is respect, enters into Nachiketa, and then he becomes inquisitive. He would like to know with this respectfulness. Now, this respect is an attitude which has been fostered by Wittgenstein when he is inquisitive about other human tendencies which are not only cognitive and linguistic. Such respect brings him close to Tagore, who himself is influenced by these tendencies. Tagore is always influenced by the fundamental wisdom of Indian heritage expounded by the rishis of the Upanishad, and we all know how much Tagore was influenced by Upanishad and Buddha, but directly we haven't got the chance to know whether Wittgenstein was also influenced by such Indian cultural heritage. But since we find close affinity and resonance between Wittgenstein and Tagore, so whatever Tagore has composed, especially Gitanjali and Raja and other poems that influenced Wittgenstein so much, so we can infer at least that this feeling that Tagore underwent while composing the poems also could be felt by Wittgenstein also. The author has remarked that the distinction between what is sensible language, that is Vyakto, and what is not of Vyakto is the central focus of both Tagore and Wittgenstein in Tractatus. This distinction between Vakto, that is manifest, and Avyakto, that is unmanifest, have special meanings in Indian philosophical culture. The category of Vyakto has several grades within it, which refers to sensible language as well as certain emotions which are not sensible in nature. But this non-sensible also is not unmanifest. Both sensible and the emotional, both are manifest. None of these is unmanifest. Thus, in Wittgensteinian terminology, the domain of sensible language does not adequately fit this whole graded domain of manifest, that is Vyakto. In the true sense of the term, Avyakta is the zone of silence because it is unmanifest. Avyakta means unmanifest. Being unmanifest, Avyakta is beyond both sense and non-sense. Here we can ask Tagore's usage of limit and beyond with reference to Vyakta and Avyakta also. Do Tagore's poems identify sensible language only as Vyakta or the whole of graded domain of manifest as Vyakta? So this Vyakta-Avyakta distinction, whether this distinction fits with the distinction of said and unsaid, can be probed into. I think there is an opportunity to find out whether this said goes completely with Vyakta and the unsaid goes completely with Avyakta. Because if Avyakta is unmanifest, then unsaid, which is nothing but shown in Wittgensteinian terminology, whether we can say this unsaid as Avyakta, because in a sense this unsaid also falls within the domain of Vyakta in the sense of manifest, because in the Indian terminology Avyakta means there no manifestation is there, it is completely inert, unmanifest. So I have observed these only a few things, and I really appreciate the effort of Priyambadadi, which is really beneficial for all of us, the scholars and students, and it is an extremely nice, thought-provoking and engaging book. And I thank you again, Professor Panda and Indranidhi and Priyambadadi and all the erudite scholars and my colleagues for such opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Datta. Now I invite Professor Islam to discuss his views. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
First, I'd like to thank the Forum for Philosophy and Professor Panda for giving me the opportunity to discuss the book Language Limits and Beyond, written by Professor Priyambada Sarkar. And I also would like to thank the author for this wonderful book. This book project, I think, can be categorized as comparative philosophy, and there are various ways to do comparative philosophy. One way of doing this is to bring two philosophers from two different traditions, cultures, and then investigate whether they can mutually inform each other, investigating the similarities and parallels. And another way of doing comparative philosophy, which is called cross-cultural philosophy, where you bring two philosophers together and then you create a dialogue between them. You engage with them in a dialogue. At the center, you have some philosophical problem, and then you try to solve that problem by taking synthesizing ideas from those philosophers who are from two very different cultures, and then you get very different perspectives, and that actually helps to solve that philosophical problem. Now, this book obviously can be put in the first category, and Professor Sarkar did extensive research in this book project, and there are some rare references. I mean, it is very hard to find secondary literature on Tagore's philosophy, especially because there are many writings on Tagore's songs, poems, literary, works, but it is very hard to find literature on Tagore's philosophy. But so it is very difficult to compare these two philosophies. But Professor Sarkar did a very nice job in this regard, and he presented some striking, very interesting similarities between these two philosophers. One is that there are, for both Tagore and Wittgenstein, there are limits to rational thought and language. To be more specific, there are limits to the factual or scientific language, but still one can transgress these limits. Okay, and also both Wittgenstein and Tagore, they were not religious in the traditional sense, but both of them were deeply religious or spiritual. And for them, God is inexpressible in the language of facts or in scientific language. And another interesting parallel is that for both of them, there is a unity of ethics, aesthetics, and religion. And now I'd like to share some thoughts stimulated by the book. One question that arises here is that how will you connect the later Wittgenstein with Tagore? Because as you know, Tagore in a sense rejected his early work. Maybe not fully rejected, but he was very critical to his position in the Tractatus. And he has the method of language games in the philosophical investigations. And for him, there are many language games, not only this factual language game on the one hand, and then on the other you have this non-factual language game, which does not say anything, only shows the inexpressible. So you have many language games, thousands of language games, and these two are only two of them. Okay, so and somewhere in the book, Professor Sarkar explicitly quoted Tagore that for Tagore also there are these two major functions of language, one descriptive and another expressive. And now, how do you connect this with later Wittgenstein? Because later Wittgenstein was very critical towards his position in the Tractatus. And another question is, what is the status of the work of Wittgenstein and Tagore and any interpretation of these two philosophers, including this book? Because when you say, suppose if you interpret Wittgenstein's philosophy or Tagore's philosophy as oneness or harmony among everything, this oneness and harmony, the way you formulate this sounds like a theory, and there is nothing suggestive or indirectness in this statement. This is a metaphysical or ontological philosophical theory. So if you interpret Wittgenstein and Tagore in this way, what is the status of this claim? That's another question that came in my mind when I was reading the book. So, but yes, Professor Sarkar touched this topic at the end of the third chapter, where he actually where the problem, this paradox, was addressed. Now, so I think Professor Sarkar will address these issues, but it is very hard. It's maybe there is no solution to this paradox. Maybe there is no way out. I don't know, but that's an interesting paradox, no doubt. And one thing that I want to draw your attention to the fact that Wittgenstein actually had a very radical meta-philosophical position, and he was very critical to traditional way of doing philosophy. And I want to draw your attention to some of his remarks. In the philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein says, it was correct that our consideration must not be scientific ones, and we may not advance any kind of theory. There must not be anything hypothetical in our considerations. All explanation must disappear, and description alone must take its place. And this description gets its light, that is to say, its purpose, from the philosophical problems. These are, of course, not empirical problems, but they are solved through an insight into the workings of our language, and that in such a way that these workings are recognized despite an urge to misunderstand them. The problems are solved not by coming up with new discoveries, but by assembling what we have long been familiar with. Philosophy is a struggle against the bewitchment of our understanding by the resources of our language. So philosophy is not like science. There is nothing hypothetical. The way scientists work, they start with a scientific question, then there's hypothesis. They look for evidence to justify or refute the hypothesis. They look for arguments. And traditional philosophers work according to this model, scientific model. They start with a philosophical problem, they put forward a hypothesis and look for arguments to establish that hypothesis. Now, Wittgenstein and the way philosophical journals and books, in the academia, this way of doing philosophy is dominant, and Bertrand Russell is a perfect example of this kind of philosophy. Now, for Wittgenstein, you cannot do philosophy in this way. Philosophy is not like science. And another remark from Culture and Value, philosophy ought really to be written only as a form of poetry. So, here, if this is true, then Tagore's poems, his songs, these are perfect examples of philosophy. And another remark, the philosopher treats question like an illness. This is from Philosophical Investigations. So one clinical psychologist once told me, for him, Tagore's songs work like therapy. So if philosophy, is as a kind of therapeutic work, then Tagore's work is perfect example of that kind of philosophy. And another quote from Raymond's book, Wittgenstein says, "As little philosophy as I read, I have certainly not read too little, rather too much. I see that whenever I read a philosophical book, it doesn't improve my thoughts at all. It makes them worse." And Wittgenstein once told Norman Malcolm that what is the use of studying philosophy if all that it does for you is to enable you to talk with some plausibility about some abstruse questions of logic, etc., and if it does not improve your thinking about the important questions of everyday life. So it is clear that Wittgenstein was not doing traditional analytical philosophy. He was not doing argumentation even. So another evidence is, if you look at the book, his main work, his later updated, matured work, Philosophical Investigations, if you randomly select some sections, for example, from 501 to 530, you get only less than half of these sentences, 43 in number, are are only in the indicative mood. Okay, 35 sentences are questions, 17 are quotations, sentences for discussion, and 10 are commonly usually to carry out a 10 are comments usually to carry out a thought experiment. Of the indicative sentences, many simply set the stage for an example or expand upon targeted quotations. So if you look at the style of his later work, the investigations, you see that this is not argumentative work. Even the Tractatus is not an argumentative work. If one is in a statement, then 1.1 is not a premise, it's just a clarificatory remark for one. Okay. So what I want to say that Wittgenstein was not doing traditional philosophy. He has a very radical new conception of philosophy and philosophers. And Tagore is a perfect example of this new conception of philosopher. And for Wittgenstein and our current academy, Wittgenstein's conception of philosophy does not go well with our current academic practice of philosophy. And if you do genuine philosophy, according to Wittgenstein, I think as I understood him, you either destroy nonsensical ideas and say nothing positive, like the way Wittgenstein himself did his philosophy. And maybe another perfect example of this way of doing philosophy is our Nagarjuna. And yes, you can do positive philosophy, but you have to do it through songs, poems, literary works. And it is not the case that you express philosophical thoughts and ideas through songs and poems. No, those songs and poems, they themselves are philosophical work. So I believe that Tagore is a perfect example of a philosopher, perfect embodiment of a new conception of philosophy that Wittgenstein proposed in his work. So I'd like to thank again the organizer for their invitation, and also I'd like to thank the author for opening this new horizon of research, because it is very hard to find comparative philosophical work which bring together both Wittgenstein and Tagore. You can find many writings separately on them, but it's very hard to find only maybe one or two articles. So she really opened a new horizon of research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Islam. Now it is over to Nadia. Nadia, please. Please unmute.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this opportunity. But at the very beginning, I'll just outline that I'm not. It's been a long time since I've been in touch with the academics properly. So my observation will be lacking the insightful enrichment discussion that the preceding panelists shared. So my view will be pretty superficial, or it might sound pretty unsophisticated also. But I'll share my views nonetheless, and I thank PS ma'am for this opportunity that she gave me. My interest in Wittgenstein is not so much because as an analytic philosopher, but more so because I saw in him some existentialist train of thought. Now, this might sound very surprising. This might sound very out of the normal, but my emphasis and my interest in philosophy was basically on the existentialist chain of thoughts, the existentialist philosophers starting from Kierkegaard, Heidegger, and all of them. And when I was reading them alongside, I started reading Ray Monk's book, The Duty of the Genius. And I saw that when Tractatus, while Tractatus was being written, Wittgenstein was fighting the war. He was in a war front. And I felt that this Wittgenstein, more than a philosopher, he was an individual who was facing death on a daily basis, who was facing the urgency of death, his being towards death on a daily basis. And thereby, the thoughts that we see or we witness in Tractatus, the residual thoughts, which the analytic philosophers would try to say as residual thoughts, that we witness in Tractatus, or something that he experienced, and because uh, what do you say that his being towards death at that point of time, what he was facing at that point of time in his life as a person who is fighting in the war front. So from that context, when I was reading Man's book, and here I'm talking about chapter 4, this is the domain of the ineffable, the religious. I saw that there has been a very in detail discussion about what can be said, what can't be said, what about the limits of language. That is what we have been speaking about since the very beginning. So yes, Tractatus is basically about outlining the limits of language, that what can be said sensibly and what can't be said sensibly. However, we have a difference of opinion when it comes to upholding that what particular aspect is the main thrust of Tractatus. I am with ma'am in suggesting that it is that part of Tractatus which is unuttered, which has been passed over in silence, where the main crux of Tractatus lies. So keeping that in mind, I'll start with this, that it is on page number 133, an attempt to express the inexpressible. That happens when we try to use language in the domain of aesthetics, in the domain of spirituality, because language is inherently inadequate to express these higher thoughts. So we know that he has set a criterion of language. Wittgenstein has set a criterion of language at the very beginning of Tractatus, that language should picture reality, and that is sensible. As long as it keeps picturing reality, it is sensible. The moment it stops doing that, it is nonsensical. It cannot, there is no sense to it. However, as Maitri ma'am has also outlined previously, that these nonsensical terms are not, nonsensical items are not to be considered trivial, they are not insignificant, rather, they are the one that confer meaning to the rest of the text, or to the stand of the philosopher as a whole. So keeping that in mind, I understand that Wittgenstein had a clear-cut demarcation of language, and he felt that language can't be used when it comes to the domain of ethics, when it comes to the domain of aesthetics. And similarly, I would like to draw a comparison, a parallel with what Soren Kierkegaard had said, and I'm talking about him in the context of his book that he has written, Fear and Trembling, that he also felt that language is severely inadequate when it comes to religious expression. Now, when we talk about Kierkegaard and we talk about his religious notion, it is not about the notion of Christianity as we understand the general conventional notion of Christianity. Kierkegaard propounded a Christianity which is very different and which is very individualistic. uh, Church, Pope has nothing to do with this notion or this understanding of Christianity. This Christianity is an individualistic relation between the individual and God. There is no mediator in it. It is fiercely personal and a private relationship. So he conceived of that particular religious aspect. And what Kierkegaard felt was that since religion is something that is so fiercely personal, and language, on the other hand, is something that is so universal, something that is spoken by everybody and understood by everybody. It has a general connotation, a universal meaning. So, language again is contrary to the very understanding of religion's term, or the very understanding of Christianity in Kierkegaard's term. So Christianity is individualistic, personal, but language is universal, it is public, it is objective, but Christianity is subjective. So there is an inherent incompatibility between language and Kierkegaard's notion of Christianity. So he ended saying that language is futile. In when we want to talk about faith, when we want to talk about God, language is futile. So he's saying that the universal language fails to capture that which is wholly individualistic, and he said that it is thoughtless to talk of faith to people who concern themselves with nothing but word. Faith as the wholly singular personal relation of the individual to the divine is essentially incompatible with the nature of language and hence remains inaccessible to language. At the same time, we find that Wittgenstein also expressed the same understanding of incompatibility of the nature of language when it comes to something that is higher, as he says, when it comes to the domain of ethics, when it comes to the domain of aesthetics, which are higher, and language is incapable of expressing this value-laden aspects of our life, right? So he says that the proposed solution of Wittgenstein is silence. What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. And a similar stance was taken by Kierkegaard. And we understand that he wrote this book, Fear and Trembling, with the name Johannes T. Silentier, which means that, which is suggestive of the underlying theme of the book. In the preface, he introduced himself as a poet. Again, we are coming to this poet part, which has been emphasized by the preceding speakers also, that Wittgenstein wanted to treat Tractatus as a literary work. Why? Because when we are talking literature, we don't have to put everything. There is a metaphorical meaning to it. We can the unutterable can be expressed in what has been uttered. So he wanted Tractatus to be taken as a literary work, just because he wanted to emphasize on those aspects of his thought which he hasn't uttered in Tractatus. And similarly, we find that Kierkegaard also introduced himself as a poet in the preface of this particular book, Fear and Trembling, and he says that philosophers dare to speculate faith, but being a poet, he simply calls at faith with awe and bewilderment, recognizing the sheer irrationality or paradox inherent in faith. So, with this in mind, talking about the incompatibility of language, or I will put it in this way, the inherent inadequacy or lack in language when it comes to the domain of something higher, something like the aesthetics or ethics for Wittgenstein and religion for Kierkegaard, and also given the fact that both of them they wanted to present their work as a literary work rather than as a work of philosophy. So, with that in mind, I would like to ask ma'am this question that because Kierkegaard came before Wittgenstein, he had written his work was already there out there. So, would you say that there was a cause and effect connotation? Like, would you say that Kierkegaard was Wittgenstein was influenced by Kierkegaard? If not, how would you put all these three thinkers, that is Kierkegaard, Wittgenstein, and Tagore, at the same in a context of silence, in a context of their approach towards what is sublime, what is of higher importance or of value. So, because for both Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein, the silence was a silence of reverence, it was a silence of awe and respect, deep respect. So, with that in mind, I couldn't help but think that would you say that there is a influence of Kierkegaard on Wittgenstein, and he had read his books, or he was influenced that which propelled him to put such a observation in Tractatus, or to take a stand as a poet and do what he did. So that's all from my end. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay.